Let's begin our bulletin in India, where New Delhi Chief Minister Arvind Kejriwal has asked the government to deploy the army over the capital's deadly riots. The Indian government has already issued shoot-at-sight orders in the capital as clashes over the controversial Citizenship Act continue. Kejriwal says police have failed to control the violence, as 20 people have been killed and nearly 200 injured during clashes. India's opposition party Congress head Sonia Gandhi says Home Minister Amit Shah must take responsibility for the violence in Delhi and resign. In a press conference, Gandhi asked why paramilitary forces were not called in earlier when the situation was getting worse. During the clashes, journalists have also been shot, punched, and asked to prove their religious identity by Hindu radicals. Earlier, members of the right-wing RSS organization vandalized 3 mosques in the Ashoknagar and Mustafabad areas. Well, Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan has called on the world community to act on Indian atrocities on the Muslim minority of the country. Referring to the New Delhi riots, Khan said 200 million Muslims are being targeted in India. Prime Minister Khan said the Indian clampdown in occupied Kashmir was just the beginning, and now bloodshed will get worse. Khan warned anyone in Pakistan targeting non-Muslim citizens or their places of worship will be dealt with strictly. The Prime Minister said Pakistan's minorities are equal citizens of this country. Well, Pakistan has recorded a strong protest with the Indian High Commission official over ceasefire violations at the line of control. The Foreign Ministry spokesperson Aisha Farooqi said Indian forces have continuously been targeting civilian areas along the border. Farooqi said 2 residents of a village in Nizapur sector sustained serious injuries due to Indian firing. She said India has committed 384 ceasefire violations this year alone. Farooqi said Pakistan has repeatedly urged the Indian side to respect the 2003 ceasefire arrangement. She said India must allow UN military observers' mission to play its mandated role as per the UNSC resolutions. In other news, the U.S. says Afghanistan's government has agreed to postpone President Ashraf Ghani's swearing in for his 2nd term. In a statement, the U.S. State Department spokeswoman Morgan Ortagus said tomorrow's ceremony will be postponed to support the peace process. The statement asked Afghan politicians to focus on peace rather than electoral politics. The Afghan Chief Executive Abdullah Abdullah's office has also confirmed the swearing-in ceremony has been postponed for 2 weeks. Meanwhile, speaking to media in Washington, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said the U.S. is on the cusp of an enormous political opportunity.
In 19 years of war, this is the first week-long break in violence by all sides, if we're successful in achieving it. If, and only if, it's successful, we will sign the U.S.-Taliban agreement coordinated with the Government of National Unity on or about February 29th.
In other news, Japan has announced an additional $17 million in aid for Rohingya Muslims taking refuge in Bangladesh. Tokyo has already granted $95 million to international bodies and non-governmental organizations. In a statement, the Japanese embassy in Dhaka said the funds will be used to improve shelter, child protection, water sanitation, and hygiene. It said the support will be used to improve life for the host community in the town of Cox's Bazar. The embassy said the Japanese government will provide assistance in Bangladesh through UN agencies. Over 750,000 Muslim refugees were forced to flee Myanmar after the 2017 military massacre, in Rakhine State. Well, Malaysia's interim Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad says he will return as full-time premier if he gets the support of Parliament. Mahathir's remarks came after King Abdullah met the country's parliamentarians for a 2nd day as political turmoil continues in the country. In a televised address, Mahathir apologized for the political crisis following his unexpected resignation. Mahathir had already floated a plan for a unity government without political parties, which was rejected by the opposition. Earlier, the king asked lawmakers to name their prime minister candidate or whether they want fresh polls. Mahathir's resignation comes amid rumors his party was planning to form a new government excluding Ibrahim Anwar. U.S. presidential candidate Senator Bernie Sanders has criticized Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, calling him a reactionary racist. Speaking at the Democratic presidential debate, Sanders said Netanyahu's policies towards Palestine were sad and tragic. The Democratic presidential candidate said the U.S.'s Middle East policy should protect Israel, but not at the cost of Palestinians suffering. Sanders said as president, he would consider moving the U.S. embassy back to Tel Aviv from Jerusalem. In late 2017, President Donald Trump unilaterally recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital, and that remains at the heart of the conflict. Well, the remaining parties of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action will meet today in Vienna to save the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. The meeting comes after Britain, France, and Germany launched a dispute process over Iran's successive pullbacks. Today's meeting at the political directors level will be chaired by the EU senior official Helga Schmidt. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said this is a chance to stop the escalation before it is too late. Last month, Tehran said it will no longer observe limits on the number of centrifuges used to enrich uranium. This was Iran's fifth step away from the deal since the U.S. withdrawal. In Syria, meanwhile, government airstrikes and artillery fire have killed 19 civilians, including 8 children in northwestern Idlib. Turkish state media and a war monitor say 4 schools were targeted. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said besides Idlib, the towns of Binish and Ma'arat Misrin were also targeted. The White Helmets said 12 civilians were wounded during the attacks. Earlier, the International Committee of the Red Cross called on the warring sides to allow for safe passage for civilians out of Idlib. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has criticized the government offensive, saying Damascus will be unable to win a military victory. He said Washington is working with Ankara to resolve the crisis. Well, the Russian-backed government offensive in Idlib has put Syrian citizens up against the wall. Trapped between bombing by Damascus and Turkey's closed border, displaced citizens in northwestern Syria have protested against the operation. More on that now in this report.
After 9 years of war, Idlib is the last rebel bastion in Syria, but it's also the country's biggest humanitarian disaster since 2011. The UN warns 900,000 people have been displaced since Damascus launched its Russia-backed offensive.
We left the town of Hassano almost a week ago. When we came here, I built this hut. We have nothing but God's mercy. I am widowed. I have 3 children, and this kid is an orphan I'm raising. He has no one but me. I've raised him since he was 5 months old.
The situation is such that IDPs are now crammed against the closed border with Turkey. People are forced to camp in the roads and fields without shelter or access to food or water. This has created an irreconcilable wedge between the regime in Damascus and the people of Idlib.
Today, our protest, we are gathered here to tell the whole world that even if there is just 1 inch of Syrian land left, we will continue to say, down with Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, down with Russian criminality, down with Iranian criminality.
Turkey already hosts 3.6 million Syrian refugees and cannot take more. Ankara has called for a humanitarian corridor in northwestern Syria to stop the inflow of displaced people. But these calls have been ignored by Damascus's major ally, Russia.
Well, the UN Security Council has approved a resolution to extend targeted sanctions for war-torn Yemen. The resolution was approved after tense negotiations between Britain and Russia, which later threatened to veto any mention of Iran. With China and Russia abstaining, 13 out of the 15 members voted for the UK drafted motion. The sanctions plan includes extending the mandate of UN experts monitoring the arms embargo imposed in 2015. That resolution extends measures providing for the freezing of assets and travel bans on targeted officials for a year. Among the disputes were references to a report that Yemen's Houthi rebels received drone parts and weapons similar to ones manufactured in Iran. The UK, US, and other Western nations supported the inclusion of the UN experts' findings, but Russia and China objected. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has arrived in Azerbaijan for a 1-day visit. Azerbaijan's President Ilham Aliyev welcomed Erdogan with an official ceremony at Zagulba Palace. He will participate in the 8th meeting of the Turkey-Azerbaijan High-Level Strategic Cooperation Council. The two countries will sign a preferential trade agreement in a strategic cooperation summit in the capital Baku. Erdogan and his Azerbaijani counterpart Ilham Aliyev will co-chair that meeting. A total of 9 agreements on trade, defense, sports, and other fields will be signed between the two countries. During the visit, the two leaders will also discuss regional developments, including Syria and Karabakh. On to China now, where another 54 people have died in the outbreak of the new coronavirus over the last 24 hours. The death toll now stands at over 2,700. This is, though, the lowest number of casualties reported in the country for 3 weeks. Cases of the virus have now exceeded 80,000 worldwide. More on that now in this report.
With COVID-19 numbers growing, authorities across the world are stepping up their campaign to contain the outbreak. China's National Health Commission says it has another 406 infections, bringing the number to over 78,000. While in South Korea, the death toll has risen to 11 and the total number of those infected have jumped to 1,146. The country now has the largest number of infections outside mainland China. In a statement, U.S. forces in South Korea said an American soldier had tested positive for the coronavirus and is in the self-quarantine at an off-base residence.
금일 오전 10시 기준으로
1,146 people have been confirmed with COVID-19, while 22 patients have discharged from the hospital after full recovery and 11 people have died. The majority of the patients are from Daegu and northern Gyeongsang province. The number of confirmed patients is increasing because members of the Shincheonji Church, especially those showing symptoms, are being intensively tested.
환자 수가 많이 나타나고 있습니다.
Italy has placed 11 towns in Lombardy and Veneto regions under quarantine. Italy is the worst hit European country as 11 people have died due to coronavirus, while the total number of confirmed cases have surged past 300. Health Ministry said the world is dealing with a virus that doesn't respect borders.
The 10 Italians, 2 have tested positive. The other 8 are symptomatic in the group. And in the medical testing that will carry on tomorrow, we have focused on 37 people who may have had contact with him, who are also Italian or from elsewhere.
The coronavirus continues to spread in Europe as Austria, Croatia and Switzerland confirmed their first cases.
Iran's Deputy Health Minister Iraj Harishi has tested positive for the coronavirus. In an interview, a health ministry spokesman said Harishi has been infected and is now in quarantine. In a video posted on Twitter, the deputy health minister promised to overcome his illness. Iran has emerged as one of the worst hit places after China. There have been 95 cases reported over the last 72 hours, with 19 confirmed deaths. On Sunday, Iran closed schools and universities in 14 provinces, dedicating 230 hospitals across the country to fight the virus. Iran's neighbors have closed their borders to prevent the disease from spreading. South Korea, meanwhile, has tightened the export of protective masks because of an acute supply shortage with the increase in coronavirus cases. Starting today, manufacturers are allowed to export to only 10% of the masks they produce. The Ministry of Food and Drug Safety said a team will discuss ways of compensating producers for the costs incurred by breaching their contracts. The sellers are banned from exporting masks under a new measure that will be effective until the 30th of April. South Korea's daily production of masks has reached 11 million units, double what it was 2 weeks earlier. The country has a shortage of masks because of the rise in demand and outbound shipments. I'll be back after a break with plenty more news. Stay tuned. Let's begin this segment of the Bulletin in the United Kingdom, which has announced an overhaul of its foreign policy approach as part of a government review. Prime Minister Boris Johnson says foreign policy experts will offer constructive challenges to traditional practices. Johnson said the UK must harness new technologies and ways of thinking to ensure foreign policy is rooted in national interests. He said the new review will seek innovative ways to promote UK interests while committing to defence and overseas aid spending targets. The review is expected to conclude later this year with input from Whitehall departments, including the Foreign Office and Ministry of Defence. Also in the UK, life expectancy has stalled in the last 10 years for the first time in 120 years of increasing life expectancy because of the decade of austerity. In a report, the Institute of Health Equity said mortality rates have surged for those living in the UK's 10% most deprived areas. IHE Director Sir Michael Marmot called the past 10 years the lost decade, saying political austerity had taken its toll. Marmot said austerity has caused rising child poverty, a decline in education funding, increases in precarious work, and zero-hours contracts. In his report, he said the housing affordability crisis had caused homelessness. Marmot said the UK needs to spend over 31% more than it currently spends on public health and education to reverse the effects of austerity. The report said life expectancy follows the social gradient, and thus the more deprived the area, the shorter the life expectancy. Well, the UN says nearly 7.5 million people in South Sudan are in dire need of humanitarian aid due to a 5-year-long civil war. The bloc's migration body says about 1.5 million people remain displaced internally, while 2.2 million are in neighboring countries. The International Organization for Migration said it has appealed for nearly $120 million to help IDPs host community members and migrants. The appeal was built on a humanitarian response plan for South Sudan for this year to continue humanitarian support it provided in 2019. The UN body said desert locusts invasion in South Sudan has been an additional threat to the food security situation. South Sudan slid into crisis in December 2013 when President Salva Kiir sacked Riek Machar as vice president on suspicion of plotting a coup. Teenage climate activist Greta Thunberg has met Pakistan's Nobel Prize laureate Malala Yousafzai at the University of Oxford. Both women have shot to global fame after standing up for major global issues, in this case climate change and women's education. Afterwards, Yousafzai shared their picture on social media, saying Thunberg is the only friend she would skip school for. After the meeting, the Swedish activist said she met her role model. Let's get to some business news now. Hong Kong has unveiled a record budget deficit caused by extra spending to jumpstart its recession-hit economy. The government has said it will give cash handouts of $1,280 each to the 7 million permanent residents. The Finance Secretary Paul Chan said the city recorded its first budget deficit in 15 years during 2019 to 2020 period at 1.5% of the GDP. Chan published an annual budget that commits 120 billion Hong Kong dollars to help alleviate the economic downturn. The new budget includes profit and salary tax breaks as well as low-interest loans for businesses struggling to pay staff wages. Chan said Hong Kong's economy faces enormous challenges. He predicted performance of between 0.5% growth and 1.5% contraction this year. European markets are trading lower as the new coronavirus outbreak continues to weigh on global investor sentiments. Major stocks have shed values following panic selling as fears grew over the rapidly spreading coronavirus outbreak outside China. Frankfurt's DAX is trading over 1% lower. London's FTSE 100 and CAC 40 in Paris have lost nearly 1% each. In Asia, Seoul's Kospi led the losses, closing over 1% lower. The Shanghai Composite and Hang Seng lost ground. Nikkei 225 lost about 0.75% on fears of slowing global growth. Meanwhile, international Brent crude oil price has lost nearly 1% over global demand concerns. Let's now find out what the weather is like around the world. And there you have it. You're all caught up. For the latest updates, though, of course, on these news stories and others, you can follow us on our social media at Indus.news. Thanks for watching this bulletin.